Hello and welcome back to our summer series of Technically Speaking, during which we are focusing on some of the decisions you can make and levers you can pull to make the performance of your applications as fast as possible, while also balancing the needs of your project. In our 8-week series, we've looked at all aspects of Unqork applications, and today we have Jessica Glissman joining us to look at all the ways RBAC impacts the performance of your application. Jess, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Jessica Glissman. I'm a Senior Director of Solutions Architecture here at Unqork. I've been with Unqork for almost 2 years. My prior experience before Unqork was all custom software development, and I sit on the delivery side of Unqork, so working with teams to build applications or advising people on how to build.
Amazing. And I've had some great experiences working with you on delivering apps and especially around RBAC. But before we jump in, what is RBAC?
Yeah, so RBAC stands for Role-Based Access Control. And in general, it means that you are grouping sets of permissions into a role, and then you are assigning a user to that role instead of assigning the user to the individual permissions. And that lets us simplify managing those permissions and makes them less prone to error. So for example, if I was a manager and I needed to approve requests on behalf of my team, and I may need to be able to create requests for myself, a team member may only need to be able to create requests for themselves. So you could create 2 different roles, each with those separate permissions. And in the future, if those permissions needed to change, for example, if the manager now needed to edit that request for their team, you could then just add that permission to the manager role rather than going in and touching each individual manager user and giving them that permission. And the same thing would apply if a user actually changes their role. So if a team member got promoted to a manager, we could just change their role and they would get all of the permissions that a manager would have without having to take something away or add something and manage that at an individual user basis.
Seems like a very efficient way to manage our users and permissions and create all the updates that we need to our applications once they're live.
Sure.
How in Unqork do we do that?
Yeah, so in Unqork, at the highest level, we have 2 places where we use RBAC. So one on the designer side for creators, so when you're administering your environment or your applications, and then on the express side where end users are accessing those applications. And since we're concerned here with the application performance, we'll focus just on that express side of RBAC. And there are 2 components to that RBAC in Unqork: roles and groups. And roles are really the permissions. So what can you do? And groups are the data access. So what data do you have access to? And within each of those constructs, there is a concept of a hierarchy and visibility into data that for people that are in your same group. So for example, a group could be a geographic locale, a line of business, anywhere where you'd want to segment that data for only people in that group to see. And then roles can be applied, as I mentioned, are permissions, and they can be applied at the environment level, at an individual module, or even a component. So if you wanted to have a field on the screen that was visible to someone and editable to somebody else, even though it's the same screen. So you have the ability to apply those permissions at all of those levels and use those 2 components or those 2 constructs together, the groups and roles, to really tailor your RBAC to your business requirements.
Using your first manager kind of example, because I know roles and groups get a little confusing for people.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're both managers, but I manage different people than you do, as a group, I should be able to see my direct reports, their requests for time off, and you would see your direct reports, but I can't see yours.
Yep, exactly.
Right?
Yep.
Okay. just want to make sure that everyone's clear on those roles and groups, because I know that sometimes we use them interchangeably when we're talking colloquially, and it's important to understand, how those are different.
Yep. Yeah, and I think exactly to that point. So in that case, the role is the ability to approve the time off or see the time off request. Those are the permissions that role would give you. And then the group is what request you actually get to see. So if it's your direct reports or your department or however it's sliced and diced for that specific business.
That makes total sense. When we're thinking about performance, I know we talked about efficiency and maintaining. Why would we want to use RBAC?
Yeah, I think, because the primary purpose of RBAC is security, there are some levers that we can use to impact performance, but they are always limited or sort of weighed or traded off against the security requirements, because we don't want to do anything on the performance side that impacts security requirements. So security will always win out, but there are some things that we can do. I think for using RBAC, so in Unqork, it's a best practice to apply permissions to every module. So this allows you to explicitly say who should have access to this screen, this API, this schema. And you want to do that rather than just inheriting what the environment has. There are a couple of exceptions to that. So if everyone will always have access to that, or if a user would be able to access that screen without logging in, for example. But in general, best practice, always apply it to every module. And then I think the second reason why you would use it, again, it's a little bit off of performance, but being able to reuse your configuration. So, which will make it easier to maintain. So for example, if you had a single screen, like in the example we were just talking about, a screen where you could see a time off request. So maybe the date, however many hours there are. And in the case of the person who's submitting the request, you can edit it, you can create it, and the approver can only view it. But it's really the same data in the same format. So by using RBAC and applying it, you can create one single module, one single screen, and just apply the different permissions. So when you go back and add an additional field, you're only doing that in one spot rather than in multiple spots, since you're reusing that same configuration.
And will that help with performance because we have less components on the screen? We're not building something twice, once viewable, one editable?
Yeah, ideally that would be the goal. And I think there are definitely trade-offs with, thinking about how much overlap there is between the roles and the groups. So for example, if you are viewing something and the things that I can see versus the things you can see have one field in common, but 50 other fields, it makes more sense to break that up into two screens so that we aren't evaluating all of those fields just to say, nope, Jessica can't see this, can't see this, can't see this, can't see this. Oh, Dara can't see this, can't see this, can't see this. So there, again, there's definitely a trade-off from a performance perspective, but if the data is largely the same and you're just toggling whether somebody can edit it or view it, then sure.
Amazing. And so we talked a little bit about why we should use RBAC. Are there levers that we can pull in RBAC to make things more performant, other than kind of combining or separating based on what the rules are?
Yeah, so I guess the three main decision points that I think through would be, first, what is the system of record for your roles and groups? So where is that information coming from? What level are you applying those permissions? So when we talked about that being either the environment, the module, or the component. And then lastly, how many groups and roles are you actually going to create or use in your application? And then going through each of those. So we think of system of record. So that could be your identity provider. So the same system you use to log into all of your applications, your email, your task tracking, all of those things that you log into as part of your normal day-to-day, you can use that same login to get into Unqork, and we can get a role from that system or a group from that system and map that in Unqork. Secondly, we could create all of those users and roles in Unqork, and all of that data comes from Unqork only. And then there's sort of also a middle ground where we could go and get incremental information after someone logs in or after we know who the user is to assign them a role. So maybe we're going to a third party to see if a user has access to a specific field or a specific kind of data. And from a performance perspective, the ideal solution is that all of that data comes from a single place. So the same place that you log in is the same place where we are able to get your permissions. And that makes it sort of a one-stop shop, one step from a performance standpoint on how you get access to the system and how we evaluate that. And then when we think about what level to apply those roles, whether it's at the environment, the module, or the component, that really sometimes can go hand in hand with how many roles and groups that you have. So there's definitely a trade-off between sort of having lots and lots of permissions and lots of roles and lots of groups and having sort of minimizing that. And the trade-off really comes between the less roles you have, the less groups you have, and sort of the highest level that you apply those permissions. It will be the most performant, but there'll be less differentiation between those roles. So we can, maybe we only have 2 sets of users and there's 2 versions of a screen. That will be more performant than 5 sets of users and 5 versions of the screen. But it will be obviously a less differentiated experience. And so the more roles and groups that you can have much more detailed control and permissions, but that could start to get less performant. So it's really finding that sweet spot between them that meets your security and your business requirements, certainly, but still is performant.
Makes total sense. And we kind of talked through some of the pros of those and why we might make certain decisions, really weighing that security. But are there any rules of thumb when we're designing the RBAC that we should think about?
Yeah, I think, so one, just thinking about it up front. So making it be part of your design process. And, you'll find hints of this in either your user personas or your user stories, where requirements might lead you towards different roles or different groups. So hearing things like someone needs to review something, somebody needs to do something on behalf of someone, somebody needs to approve something, somebody needs to create. So those should all be sort of setting off bells and whistles that there's probably a role here and maybe even a group. And then I think we touched on this a little bit, but the overlap of your applications. So in some cases, it may make more sense from a performance standpoint to create multiple applications tailored to the individual users to make them more performant. So maybe in the case of the time off, request that we were talking about, maybe somebody needs to maintain the list of holidays and the list of out of office codes, whether you're going to be out sick or whether you're taking PTO. So that ops user who's maintaining all of that data, it may likely make sense that all becomes a separate application where they can manage that. And that's only accessible for the ops user. And that prevents us from, in sort of the reverse, if we added that screen to the main application where you could create a request and also administer the data, then we now have to wall that new ops administration screen off from all of the other users, so only an ops team member can see it, and vice versa, keep the ops team member from the other functionality. And so in that case, splitting those up will make both of those applications more performant because they are tailored to the role. And then I think probably similar to some of the other topics is really keeping it simple. So don't over-engineer things. You can always add roles and groups as your application evolves or your suite of application evolves. And I think the easiest way to think about that, or the best way to think about it, is RBAC is a set of decisions that your application needs to make as it's rendering or as it's doing something. So generally, the less decisions your application needs to make about what to show, when, and to what role, the more performant it will be.
I think that's the key to the whole thing, is limiting those decisions and making the decisions that you need for the application in this point in time, not always thinking into the future, though a little future planning is great, but still keeping it as simple and as performant and secure as possible.
Definitely, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Jess, for joining us. We appreciate it. And we learned a lot about RBAC and performance today. We will be back next week on Friday with Brad Kelly to talk a little bit about screen rendering.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.